Hello there, YouTube. This is Sibbles and Bits back at it again with Sit Down Saturday. We're recording this on Friday, but of course, by the time that this comes out, you guys don't really care about that. Today, we're going to finally talk about the damage formula. The reason why this didn't come out earlier is because I had an understanding on how the damage formula worked. After I started working on this video, I realized a ton of bugs, but it turns out the bugs were actually the notes that I had taken beforehand, probably back in like beta or something like that. And so those bugs were either fixed or I tested it against a bugged thing that hasn't been fixed. So if anything here looks off, like feel free to let me know and I'll look into it. But as far as I am aware, my understanding has now been rectified as far as Season 2 mid-season, and so I'm able to hopefully teach you guys about the damage formula and how it works. Because at the end of the day, we all know Inkbound is complicated, but thankfully the damage formula isn't that complicated so long as you understand all the stats in the game, which multiplicative bins they fit into, and how to efficiently increase your power. So just as a quick introduction, whenever you're looking at a damage formula, it's important to know where your multipliers are in an RPG. And I refer to these as multiplicative bins. Some people might refer to them as damage categories. However you go about this, I have these columns color-coded and in columns so that they're easier to understand, and we'll go through all of them. It's important to note that everything that is in the same bin, or column in this case, is all added together before being multiplied against every other bin, and then eventually you'll come up with your final damage. Now, due to the way that the game rounds decimals, you might have a difference of about 1 damage, but otherwise, like I said, this is the most accurate representation that I've been able to test up to date. So we're going to first start with base damage. So base damage is whatever your skill is listed to deal without any augments or power. That's an important thing to note because during the run, unless of course it's the tooltip itself is bugged, the tooltip will update to reflect your augments and your ability power. Even if you're looking in the collection, if you have ability power or physical power, it will update those dynamically as well. So as long as you're in a run, you're going to have to assume that it's adding your augments and your power together. If you notice that your augments and power are not adding into this correctly, send an F8 to the devs so that they can fix it. There's a lot of broken tooltips in the game. It's still early access. I try to get them where I can. So we take our skills listed base damage. For an example that will go into more detail as we finish going through all these bins, we're going to assume that we're Magma Miner and we're using Smash. So we deal a base damage of 150 damage. Now this can be increased with augments. Smash itself has a common augment that does plus 45 damage, a blue augment that does plus 120. For the sake of our example, we will assume that we have one of those augs, so we will add 120 damage. You can also increase your damage with vestiges, although this is typically only the case with the Obelisk Crush or Star Captain's drones. As far as I know, there's not really anything that a vestige will increase your base damage. We will also technically consider stats because the damage formula works with status effects too, such as poison, burn, and frostbite. So obviously if you're doing a status effect, then technically you're increasing your damage or your base damage with the frostbite damage, poison damage, burn damage stat, and so that'll increase its base damage too. So if you were going to assume that you were using frostbite damage and you grabbed plus 10 frostbite damage, then technically your base damage with frostbite is 45. Then we go over to power. Power is the most common multiplier that you're going to find, in my opinion, because, well, it's pretty much everywhere. Just as sort of like an introduction, each individual point of power that you have is plus 10% damage. So if you have 1 power, it's 10% damage. If you have 10 power, it's 100% damage. So in other words, it's plus another base damage on top of itself. as shown here. If I were to say that I had 10 power, all of a sudden my damage doubles, and over here I'm doing 540 damage. Now, I refer to it broadly as power because ability power will apply to your damage regardless of if it's tagged as physical or magic, and then of course each source of damage is tagged as physical or magic and therefore will be increased by physical or magic power respectively. Again, a reminder that these add, and another important thing to stipulate is that these stats can technically go negative. Most notably, you have Burden of Wisdom, which is a green vestige that gives you -4 physical power, 4 magic power, and then Unstable Brew, which will give you +15 ability power this turn, -15 the next turn. So despite the fact that your stats can go negative, it is, as I will refer to as, because I don't have any better way to explain it, clamped at 0. Your stat's going to go below 0, but it's never going to reduce your damage because it's still going to consider that your power is at least 0. So you can never do less than base damage just because of where your power is at. Since we are theoretically playing as a magma miner, in this example, we are going to go ahead and say that we have 10 heat. Each stack of heat is 1 ability power, so we're going to just go ahead and plug that in. Then we come up against the damage taken bin. I call it the damage taken bin. The devs call it the incoming damage bin, which would work if all of these said incoming damage. They're all worded completely differently. It's very easy to confuse that these are all actually in the same multiplicative bin. The easiest way to remember it is that anything that says plus X% damage is additive together because it's in the same multiplicative bin. And so in here, we have Shatter or Hex, depending on if you're doing physical damage or magic damage respectively. Vulnerable is like Shatter or Hex, except that it applies to both and is slightly stronger, but incredibly rare. I think there's only one source of it in the game, and that is one of the Grasp Ascensions. There's Mark, which is kind of a tricky one. It says plus 100% incoming damage for enemies, and it stacks, but it doesn't stack 100% incoming damage per mark that you have on them. Instead, it is plus 100% for an amount of hits equal to the stacks that they currently have. Another important thing to note is that if you're trying to math out statuses, this only applies to hits, so it will not increase your burn damage. You also have augments, specifically on the elemental drafted bindings. Incendiary, Poison Vapors, Cone of Frost will give, they all have a purple augment that says deal plus 25% damage versus enemies with poison or with burn, whatever it is. It makes it feel like it's specifically for that skill, but it's important to know that those are actually global modifiers that will apply to any damage that you deal. And it doesn't matter where that source of poison came from. It can come from poison vapors, it can come from a different vestige you have, it can come from a teammate who doesn't even have this. If that enemy has poison on it, you will deal plus 25% more damage. There's also vestiges that have the same type of mechanic. There's Sovereign's Flag, which is plus 25% damage versus dazed, and then you got Burning Heart and Poisoned Heart, which will give plus 35% damage versus burning and poisoned enemies respectively. And then of course you have, like I said, enemy buffs like Glass Cannon, which increases their damage by 50% and increases the damage they take by 50%. I believe that's the exact wording. Again, this is additive with the rest of these. So in our example, we are going to assume that we have Incendiary with the purple aug for plus damage versus burn because we're Magma Miner, and that's generally what people do. And we're also going to assume that we have Shattering Bonk and we've applied Shatter because we're trying to use Smash. So we are going to deal 55% increased damage. Now we're going to move on to crit damage. Crit damage, like power, is expressed as a number, not a percent, except unlike power, it goes from a 1-to-1 ratio instead of a 1-to-10 ratio. You start with 50 critical damage, which is 50% increased damage whenever you deal a critical strike. And then, of course, you can increase this with critical damage stat from a variety of sources, but that's pretty much the only way to increase this. Then you have enemy damage resistance. This is somewhat rare, but also not necessarily. The most time that you're going to see this reliably is on bosses, either villains or guardians. Runestone, for example, has a certain amount of damage resistance in order to have more effective health, and so does Argoloth, so that you interface with their mechanics. You also see this on Captor, who has 25% damage resistance according to the amount of other enemies that are on the field. But also, most notably, burrowers, while they are burrowed, have 50% damage resist. You can apply book mods that will increase the amount of damage resist that enemies have, and sometimes they have stuff like Prismatic Barrier that will also give them damage resist. And I think this patch made it so that they can't get defensive mods like Prismatic Barrier, but otherwise it was possible that if a burrower was burrowed and also had Prismatic Barrier versus your damage type, they have 100% damage resist, so they reduce your damage by 100%. You deal 0 damage. Thankfully, they have since patched that, and that's less likely to happen, but it's still possible with some book mods to get pretty darn close. We're going to assume that an enemy here does not have damage resist, but let's just go ahead and say that in that scenario, an example of that would be if you did have that burrower and you had the one mod that was enemies have 40% damage resist, and each time you hit them they lose 1 stack, each of which being 20, then they have a total of 40 resist, plus they're burrowed. Those add together, so it's 90%, which is otherwise referred to as 0.9. We subtract that from 1 since we're multiplying into this a little bit weird. I didn't really set this up necessarily the best for that. So we're dealing 0.1% damage, and so you can see that we lose pretty much all of our damage. So definitely be wary of that, and that's why I really don't like putting like damage resist on enemies, because even if you say, all right, let's put this at a 0.4, losing more than half your damage does not feel fun. Anyways, so that is how all these damage bins work. And it's very important that when you're building a build, I would say that they're important in order from left to right. Like, obviously, there's not a lot of ways for you to get base damage, but it's the one that you're going to get the most of because you have a skill and you might augment it for plus damage. You're going to slowly gather power over the course of the game. I would say it's the most common, besides, of course, base damage multiplier that you have access to. And then you're going to want to start looking for these damage taken multipliers and starting to add them into there. Crit is probably the one that you can do the least without, but obviously if it's pertinent to your run, then it's also pretty good to be grabbing that as well. Anyways, so we are going to go back to our exercise that we've been alluding to this whole time, and we are going to assume an in-game scenario. Most notably, especially on the channel, but a lot of people are trying to find their way around this. Let's assume that you're in tier 20 and you're going up against a Book 2 Lusk. Now, on phase 2, he will have 2 little Lusks spawn from the last turn, and then he will spawn an additional 4. So now there is 6 little Lusks on the field. They're going to be doing global 8, and he's going to be doing global 11. That's 59 incoming damage. Obviously, you can't handle with that. But if you're able to kill all the little Lusks, obviously that makes it a lot easier to deal with. So how are we going to do that? We're going to assume that we have shocked an enemy, also shattered an enemy, and then we also have plus damage versus burn, and there's also burn on Lusk already. And we're going to try to use Smash to get rid of them. Now, in order to deal enough damage to kill a little Lusk, which is 330, it's like, let's just say 350. It's pretty close. It's like 330 something, because they have 300 base health, and then I believe they gain 10% more damage at that difficulty level, or 10% more health, my apologies. So then they would have somewhere around 330. But again, the math gets a little bit weird with multipliers, especially in like enemy health, and sometimes it goes up like a smidgen. Anyways, 330 damage, so if an enemy is shocked, which deals 50% of our damage, we will need to deal, let's say, 700 damage. It's actually like 670 if we wanted to get technical there. So in this instance, we are able to do more than 670 damage. But now let's start taking stuff away. Let's assume that we don't have a critical charge. So now we're still able to do this damage. Okay, now let's go ahead and take away our augment that we have for plus 120 damage. So we're only dealing 150. That's going to drop our damage significantly because we're losing like half. So now, as you start taking like little bits and pieces away, it becomes harder to reach this break point. Another thing that you could do is maybe have Lusk marked, right? So then this would be 1.55. Now we're able to meet our breakpoint. We could also maybe have Glass Cannon on, which is another plus 10 ability power. We're able to meet our breakpoint. So there's many ways for you to actually get to a point to where you can make these breakpoints. And like I said, it's a lot easier if you grab from a lot of different areas. So let's just say that for whatever reason you have 3 glass cannons. So we have, say, 30 power. If you grab another glass cannon, that's only another 10 ability power. So you're increasing your power by, like, say, 33%. Okay, so then we're going to go from 930 up to 1162, probably 1163 because it rounds up. Let's go ahead, go back there, and just give ourselves a blue aug for plus 120 damage. Or we could even just say that it's a white aug, right? 195 because we're adding plus 45. We're getting just around the same amount of damage and we're not taking increased damage. If this was instead the blue aug, we've now got more damage. So that's where finding out exactly how much to put into each of these bins is important. Of course, if you're able to get into a situation where you spool out of control, maybe you have Trickster's Hook or something that's able to just constantly scale your ability power or your physical power because you get Window of Eternal Longing and all of a sudden you're at 30 power. Like at this point you've pretty much won the game, but taking another vestige that gives you another 5 power isn't really going to help you that much. But if you're able to get another multiplier, like let's say you find a way to get vulnerable, that's going to give you considerably more damage. I would say another example that you might go about in the same exact scenario is, okay, instead of using shock, how about we find another way to deal with these lusks? You might say, okay, let's try and do like AoE to destroy these lusks. In my opinion, probably the best thing in that idea would be Smoke Bomb. Again, assuming that we are a Magma Miner and we don't have access to, like, say, Seismic Slam or something like that. So, Smoke Bomb has 50 base damage. We're going to go back and assume that we have full power or full heat. And we're going to assume that these enemies don't really have anything on them because they just spawned. We would have to hit them in order to actually have a multiplier on them. We're trying to assume that we're hitting everything. So we're going to take away our damage taken multiplier. We will assume that we have a crit. And so we have to get this number up to like 350. And so you start looking at things like, okay, well, the odds of us having a second purple aug are very low. But if we did, we could have 125 base damage, and that would be able to fit the bill. But we already took our purple was screen-wide AoE so that we could hit all the lusks at once. So that doesn't really apply. If, for whatever reason, we had an Ascension, and so we had 100 damage for Concussion Grenade, that would still not quite cut it, and we would have to find another way for making sure that we could deal that damage. So let's go ahead and assume that we have like just a little bit more power. Let's say that we have Training Weights, which is just plus 3 physical power. If we were to add that, we would just barely be able to make this breakpoint with an Ascension, a purple AUG to give us screen-wide AoE, 13 power, which again, assuming that we have full heat, is also a little irregular as well, so you're probably getting this through other sources, but 13 power and critting would be able to get us there. Anyways, if you have any questions, because I completely scuffed up that demonstration, be sure to put them down in the comments below. If you have anything to add as far as like things I'm either missing or having correct, be sure to put that down in the comments below too. Certainly don't want to spread any misinformation. If you have any other sort of feedback, questions, concerns, comments, misplay alerts, be sure to put that down in the comments below too. And until next time, I'll catch you guys around.